There is a particular kind of silence that follows a judge's gavel. It isn't the silence of peace. It isn't the silence of resolution. It's the silence of a life being divided, legally, procedurally, without ceremony, into what you keep and what you lose. And if you're sitting on the wrong side of that courtroom, if the paperwork doesn't favor you, if the years you invested weren't the kind that show up on a balance sheet, then that silence can feel like the ground dropping out from under you. Sarah Calloway walked out of the Westchester County Family Court on a Tuesday in February carrying two things: a manila envelope with her copy of the divorce decree, and the faint but unmistakable understanding that she had just become, at 34 years old, financially invisible. Her marriage of 11 years was over. Her husband Daniel kept the house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Larchmont they'd renovated together, room by room, over the better part of a decade. He kept the car. The newer one. He kept custody of their daughter Lily, primary custody, because the courts weigh employment stability heavily and Sarah hadn't drawn a paycheck since Lily was born 9 years earlier. He kept the investment accounts, the beach property his parents had contributed to, and the commercial real estate firm that bore both their names in spirit, if not on paper. What Sarah walked out with, $200 remaining after legal fees that had eaten through her savings. A 6-month spousal support arrangement that his attorney had framed as generous. 2 suitcases in her sister Diane's car, parked outside. And an old industrial sewing machine in Diane's garage, a Juki straight stitch her late father had used for 30 years repairing theater costumes, that Sarah hadn't touched since the funeral. Now, I need you to hold 2 things at once as I tell you this story. The first thing is the unfairness of it. The statistical, documented, measurable unfairness of what happens to economically dependent spouses in divorce, especially women who stepped out of careers to raise children and run households, who did invisible labor for years with no legal mechanism to value it. That's real. That's documented. That matters. The second thing is this: for years later, Sarah Calloway's business generated $340,000 in a single year. She sat across from a national television host with calm, easy authority. She had a studio, a team, a waiting list that stretched 6 months. She had built something from almost nothing, not despite the loss, but in some way she is still working to articulate, through it. And Daniel watched from a hotel room in Chicago. This is the full story of how she got there. To understand what Sarah lost, you have to understand what she gave up voluntarily, years before anyone handed her a court order. She grew up in Albany, New York, the older of 2 daughters. Her father, Mick Calloway, was a craftsman, not by trade exactly, but by nature. He worked in facilities management for a regional theater company, which meant that for most of Sarah's childhood, their garage was full of things in various states of repair. Chairs with loose legs, costumes waiting to be hemmed, sets that needed repainting. He was the kind of man who couldn't see a broken thing without wanting to fix it. Sarah inherited that completely. She was drawing clothes in the margins of her notebooks by age 9. By high school she was altering her own jeans, then her friends' jeans, then eventually prom dresses, charging $20 here, $30 there, which she considered practically highway robbery at the time. Her guidance counselor told her parents that Sarah had an unusual combination of technical precision and aesthetic instinct, which is the kind of thing guidance counselors say when a student is genuinely talented and they don't have a better framework for it. She enrolled in the fashion design program at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in Manhattan, on a partial scholarship and the rest in loans. She thrived. Not in the loud, attention-seeking way that some design programs reward, but in a quieter, more durable way. Her professors noticed that she could look at a garment and understand its failure immediately, where the pattern had gone wrong, why the fabric was pulling, what the maker had been trying to achieve and where the execution had slipped. She had, as one of her professors put it, a diagnostic eye. She also had a gift for restoration, specifically, taking something damaged and finding the pathway back to what it was meant to be. She did a semester project on conservation techniques for historic textiles that her program director later submitted to a small academic journal. She was 20 years old. After graduation, she took a position at a mid-size alterations and costume shop in the garment district. It wasn't glamorous. It paid $28,000 a year, which in Manhattan in the early 2010s was an exercise in creative budgeting. But she loved the work, the precision of it, the way each day brought her something different to solve. She met Daniel Reeves at a friend's birthday party in the spring of her second year out of school. He was 29, already running his own small commercial real estate consultancy out of a shared office in Midtown. He was tall, charming in a focused way. Not the kind of charming that performs for the room, but the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in it. He asked Sarah about her work with a specificity that surprised her. Most people, when she explained what she did, nodded politely and changed the subject. Daniel asked follow-up questions. Good ones. They dated for 2 years. He was attentive, organized, reliable in ways that Sarah, who had grown up in a warm but somewhat chaotic household, found deeply attractive. He sent flowers on her birthday and remembered which restaurants she didn't like and came to see her when she was sick without being asked. She was in love with him. Genuinely, completely, with the particular clarity that comes in your mid-20s when you're certain, for the first time, that you've made the right choice. They married in October, in a small ceremony upstate. Her father danced with her at the reception to a song she can't listen to anymore. He died of a heart attack 14 months later, leaving her his sewing machine, his tools, and a specific kind of grief that doesn't fully resolve, it just changes shape over time. In the second year of their marriage, Daniel's firm began growing quickly. He landed 2 significant commercial clients, brought on a partner, moved to a larger office. The hours lengthened. The weekends thinned. Sarah was working her own long hours at the shop, and for a while the 2 trajectories simply ran parallel, 2 busy people building their own things, coming home tired, making it work. When they found out Sarah was pregnant with Lily, they had a long, honest conversation about childcare. Long honest, they thought. The math was complicated. Manhattan childcare for an infant was running $2,200 to $3,000 a month. Sarah's salary, after taxes, left very little margin above that. And Daniel's firm, now generating real revenue, now requiring more of him, needed, he said, stability at home. Predictability. It's temporary, he told her. 2 years, maybe 3. Until the firm is fully stable and we can afford good help. Then you go back. Sarah thought about it for a long time. She talked to her sister. She talked to her mother. She talked to a friend who had done the same thing and didn't regret it. She left her job at the end of her second trimester. She told herself it was temporary. Here's what nobody told her, clearly enough, at the time: every year you are out of the workforce, your professional identity thins a little more. Your network goes quiet. Your skills, in a technical field, begin to fall slightly behind. The gap on your resume, initially 1 year, becomes 2, becomes 5, becomes something that hiring managers look at with an expression they try to make neutral. And financially, legally, you have not been building anything in your own name. The law is beginning to catch up with this reality, but it moves slowly. In most U.S. jurisdictions at the time of Sarah's divorce, 11 years of unpaid domestic labor translated to a modest spousal support arrangement and not much else. None of this was in the foreground when Lily was born. Nothing was in the foreground then except the baby, and the tiredness, and the specific fierce love that rewrites everything you thought you knew about yourself. The problem with marriages that erode gradually is that you can never identify the exact moment it started. It isn't a crack. It's a drifting, the way 2 boats tied to the same dock can gradually move, inch by inch, until one day you look across and realize the gap between them has grown to something you'd have to swim. Sarah identified, in retrospect, several moments. Not the decisive one, there wasn't one, but a sequence of smaller ones, each unremarkable on its own. There was the year Daniel stopped asking about her day. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration. Just gradually, the way a habit fades when the conditions that formed it change. She would say something about Lily, or about the neighbor's new construction, or about an article she'd read, and Daniel would respond with half his attention, the other half on his phone or his laptop, or the particular distant expression she came to associate with a man who was physically present but mentally elsewhere. She told herself he was stressed. The firm was growing, yes, but growth comes with pressure, and she knew that. She tried to be understanding. There was the year he hired a new associate, a woman named Cassandra who was 26, sharp, and available in all the ways that Sarah, with a toddler and a household to manage, was not. Sarah didn't suspect anything then. She noticed the name came up often. Cassandra handled that, Cassandra found the client, Cassandra is incredibly efficient. And she filed it somewhere in her mind under work friend without examining it further. There was the year Lily started school and Sarah told Daniel, quietly but clearly, that she wanted to start working again. Something small. Maybe alterations from home. Maybe she could reach out to her old contacts, see if anyone needed consulting work. Daniel didn't refuse. He listened carefully, nodded, and then said, "Of course. Whatever you want. But Lily just started school, and the adjustment period matters. Maybe let's revisit in spring." Spring came. There was a reason in spring. Then fall. Then the following year. Sarah stopped bringing it up. She isn't entirely sure when or why. Whether it was the friction of the conversation, or the sense that she was asking for permission for something that should have been hers by default, or simply the exhaustion of managing a household and a child and a husband who had become, by degrees, more roommate than partner. She started noticing the phone. Not in a surveilling way, she wasn't that kind of person. But small things. The way it was always face down on the table. The way he'd take calls in the other room when he never used to. The way he'd come to bed later and later and she'd pretend to be asleep because the alternative was a conversation she didn't know how to start. She was 32 when she finally asked him directly. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, Lily at a sleepover, the particular quiet of a house without a child in it. Sarah had made coffee. The light was good. She set a mug in front of him and said, without anger, without drama, just with the precision she applied to everything, "I need to know if something is happening with Cassandra." He didn't deny it right away. He set down his coffee. He looked at the table. And in the pause before he spoke, Sarah felt the entire architecture of the last 11 years shift beneath her. "It's complicated," he said. Those two words did more damage than anything that came after. The next months were what they are, the particular slow-motion disaster of a marriage ending. There were conversations, several of them, that oscillated between grief and anger and strange pockets of something that felt almost like relief, which Sarah hated herself for feeling. There were silences at dinner. There were nights she cried in the bathroom with the water running so Lily wouldn't hear. There were mornings she woke up and for exactly 3 seconds, before full consciousness arrived, everything was fine. Daniel moved into the firm's secondary office apartment in October, 7 months after that Sunday morning conversation. He was unfailingly polite. That, somehow, was the hardest part. The attorney Sarah found through a friend of a friend, charged on a sliding scale, overworked and underpaid but decent, told her within the first meeting to be realistic. The assets were primarily in Daniel's name. The firm was structured as an LLC with documentation that made its value difficult to challenge. Her support claim was strong but limited in duration. Primary custody was likely to go to Daniel given his stable employment and her lack of independent income. "The courts aren't cruel," the attorney told her. "They just use a metric that doesn't account for what you've actually been doing for 11 years. Sarah drove home from that meeting and sat in the parking lot of a Whole Foods for 45 minutes before she could make herself go inside. She bought a bag of pasta and a can of tomato sauce. She cried in the car again on the way home. She made dinner for Lily, and helped with homework, and read 3 chapters of a book about a girl who tames wild horses, and kissed her daughter goodnight, and didn't let any of it show. This is worth saying plainly, the thing Sarah was doing during those months, managing her grief and her terror and her anger while continuing to show up completely for a 9-year-old who was already navigating her own version of this loss, was one of the hardest things a person can do. And there is no line on a resume for it. There is no financial value assigned to it. It simply happened, the way so much of Sarah's labor had simply happened, invisibly, for years. The decree was finalized on a Tuesday. February. Cold, gray, the specific defeated light of a northeastern winter that seems designed to offer you as little encouragement as possible. Sarah's sister Diane picked her up from the courthouse. Diane was 4 years younger, worked in nonprofit fundraising, lived in Astoria in a 2-bedroom apartment with a spare room that had, until 2 months earlier, been used for storage. She'd cleared it out when things started to look definitive. They drove back mostly in silence. At some point Diane reached over and put her hand on Sarah's arm and said, "You're going to be okay," and Sarah said, "I know," and meant maybe 40% of it. The spare room had a bed, a dresser, and a window that faced the building across the street. Sarah unpacked her 2 suitcases and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. $200. 6 months of spousal support. $1,200 a month, which in New York City covers your groceries and your share of a utility bill and not a great deal else. Lily, every other weekend. A divorce decree in a manila envelope. And the sewing machine. It was still in Diane's garage where it had lived since Mick's funeral, covered with a tarp, next to a box of his tools and a rack of her sister's old bikes. Sarah hadn't looked at it since the day they loaded it into the moving truck 3 years earlier. It had felt too raw then. Too much of her father in the mechanism of it, in the oil smell and the particular weight of the foot pedal. She hadn't been ready. She went out to the garage 2 days after moving in. February 11th. She pulled the tarp off. The machine was fine. Juki Industrial Straight Stitch, 1989, the kind built to last indefinitely if you maintain it. Her father had maintained it obsessively. She checked the tension, tested the bobbin, ran a scrap of fabric through it. The stitch was perfect. She stood in the cold garage for a long time. She wasn't thinking about a business plan. She wasn't thinking about a brand. She was thinking about the fact that her hands remembered something her resume didn't reflect, and that she needed, not for financial reasons in that moment, but for reasons that were harder to name, to make something. She went inside and made coffee and sat at Diane's kitchen table and wrote 4 words on the back of an envelope. "Things I still know." Then she wrote under it, "How to look at something broken and see what it was supposed to be." Then she crossed that out because it was too abstract. Then she wrote, sewing, fabric, repair, restoration, pattern, construction. All of it. She taped the envelope to the wall above the kitchen table. She went to the laundromat down the block the next morning with a handwritten index card, alterations and repairs, fast, careful, affordable. Call Diane and the phone number. She taped it next to the change machine. She taped 2 more in the coffee shop and the dry cleaner. Then she went home and waited. The first call came 3 days later. An elderly man named Gerald Hoffman, 78 years old, retired, had found the card at the laundromat. His wife Edna had died 8 months earlier after 43 years of marriage. Their granddaughter, who was 12, was inheriting some of Edna's things, and one of them was a camel-colored wool coat, a good coat, a real one, the kind they made in the early 1970s that cost serious money and lasted forever if you treated it right. But Edna had been a large woman, and Miriam, the granddaughter, was thin, and the coat needed significant structural alteration to fit her. Could Sarah do it? Sarah said yes. Gerald came by the next afternoon. He was quiet, a little formal in the way of men of his generation, the handshake and the eye contact and the small, serious courtesy of someone who had learned manners as a non-optional feature of character. He handed her the coat carefully, the way you hand over something that has weight beyond its fabric. Sarah looked at it for a long time before she said anything. It was a beautiful coat. Wool crepe, fully lined in ivory silk, with a structured shoulder that the original tailor had cut with real precision. The years had treated it well, Edna had stored it properly, kept the moths out, kept it clean. There was a small repair on the left cuff, done in the 1980s by someone who had known what they were doing. She wore it every winter, Gerald said. I can see that, Sarah said. She took care of it. She took the measurements. She told him it would take a week and cost $30, which she later recognized as significantly undercharging for the complexity of the job. Gerald thanked her with the particular formal courtesy he'd carried in and left. Sarah worked on the coat for 4 days. Not because it required 4 days, technically, the alterations could have been completed in a focused afternoon. But she found herself working slowly, deliberately, attending to each seam with a care that exceeded what was strictly necessary. She replaced the lining on one section that had begun to fray, didn't charge for it, just did it. She reinforced the shoulder pad on the side where the original basting had weakened. She pressed each seam with a damp cloth and a patience that felt almost meditative. When she was done, the coat looked like it had never been anything but Miriam's size. Gerald came to pick it up on a Saturday. He put on his reading glasses to examine the seams and he stood there very quietly for a moment and then he took his glasses off and his eyes were wet and he said, she would have loved knowing this. He paid Sarah $30 and a $10 tip. He shook her hand again at the door. Sarah waited until she heard the gate close at the end of the walkway before she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her arms. She cried for about 10 minutes. Not entirely from sadness, there was something else in it, something that felt almost like recognition. Like finding a frequency she'd forgotten she could receive. She called Diane from the other room and said, I think I remember what I'm for. Diane said, I know. I've been waiting for you to remember. Here is the truth about building a business from almost nothing, from a spare bedroom in someone else's apartment, with no capital and no client list and no professional reputation in your name. It is not romantic. It is not a montage. It does not have a soundtrack. It is Gerald's coat, and then a hem that comes out wrong at a prom dress and has to be done twice at no charge, and then 2 weeks of silence from the index cards, and then a bride who finds her through a friend, and then a billing question she doesn't know how to answer, and then the moment in March when she realizes she has made $340 in 6 weeks and the math is genuinely alarming. It is Diane's kitchen table at 11 at night, trying to figure out how to create an Instagram account, reading tutorials on her phone because she doesn't entirely know what she's doing. It is photographing her work against a white bedsheet pinned to the wall, learning by trial and error that the light from the east window at 9 in the morning is the most useful light in the apartment. It is calling herself the careful Stitch because she spent 2 hours trying to come up with names and none of them were right, and then she looked down at what her hands were doing and the answer was sitting there. It is writing the first caption, deleting it, writing it again. Not marketing copy, something more honest than that. She wrote about the prom dress, the second time she hemmed it, why the first attempt had failed and what she'd done differently. She wrote it the way her father had talked about repair, with specificity, with respect for the material, with the understanding that every garment has an intention inside it and your job is to find it. 43 people followed the account in the first week. She recognized about 12 of them. She kept posting. Not daily, she didn't have enough volume for that. But when she had something to show, she showed it. And she wrote about it with the same precision every time. By May, something started to shift. A woman named Patricia had found her through a mutual contact and brought in a 1960s Chanel skirt suit that had belonged to her mother. One button was missing, one seam had split, and the lining had deteriorated past what Patricia had hoped. She'd been to 2 other alteration shops. Both had told her the suit was beyond reasonable repair given the cost. Sarah looked at it and said, 2 weeks. I need to source the right button and match the lining fabric. She named a price that was 3 times what the other shops had quoted for the partial work they'd offered. Patricia left it. Sarah worked on that suit like it was a thesis. She called 4 textile suppliers to find a button that matched. She sourced a lining fabric that was period-appropriate in weight and weave. She documented every step, not for any particular purpose at first, just because documentation was how her brain processed things. When Patricia came to pick it up, she wore it out of the apartment. She said, "My mother would have wept." She put the before and after photos on her own Instagram. Tagged the careful stitch. She had 4,200 followers. Sarah woke up the next morning to 340 new followers and 11 inquiry messages. She sat at Diane's kitchen table and looked at her phone for a long time. Then she made coffee, opened her notebook, and started making a list of what she needed to scale. The summer was hard in a way that the spring hadn't been. More volume should mean more income. And it did, incrementally. But it also meant she was running the machine 6 hours a day, managing inquiries on her phone, trying to figure out pricing and turnaround times and how to politely tell someone that no, she couldn't turn around a full coat restoration in 3 days. She had Lily every other weekend and those were non-negotiable. She would not miss them, would not reschedule, would not let work eat into the hours that belonged to her daughter. She had a breakdown in August. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind, where you realize one afternoon that you've been running on 3 hours of sleep for 6 consecutive nights and your hands are cramping and you haven't eaten a real meal since Wednesday and you're sitting in the bathroom on the edge of the tub because it's the only room in the apartment where you can close a door. Diane found her there. Sat down on the floor next to her. Didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then she said, "You need help." "I can't afford help." "Not yet. But you need to figure out how to get there." Diane made pasta. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had taped the envelope, where she'd built the Instagram account, where she'd done the math 100 times, and they talked until midnight. Not about the business specifically. About what Sarah was trying to build. What it was for. What she needed it to become. "You're not building an alteration shop," Diane said. "What am I building?" "I don't know exactly. But it's bigger than this room." Sarah looked at her phone. The careful stitch had, as of that night, 2,800 followers. "I need a studio," she said. "A real one." "Yes," said Diane. "I'm 6 months from being able to afford one." Then figure out what the 6 months looks like. In September, 6 months and 22 days after the divorce was finalized, Sarah received a direct message from a vintage clothing shop in Brooklyn called Reverie. The message was from the owner, a woman named Josephine who had been referred by Patricia of the Chanel suit. Reverie had acquired an estate lot, 41 pieces of mid-century women's clothing, primarily wool coats and structured suits from the 1940s and 1950s. The estate had been stored improperly for several decades, which meant moth damage, oxidation, several broken closures, and lining deterioration across almost every piece. Josephine had been told, by more than one source, that Sarah was the person to call. She was offering, initially, $1,800 for the full lot. Sarah took a day to think about it. Then she called Josephine back and said she would take the job for $3,200, with a 10-week completion timeline, and that she'd need a $500 deposit to source materials. She expected pushback. There was a pause on the phone. Then Josephine said, "Done." Sarah hung up and walked directly to the garage and stood next to her father's machine for a minute with her hand on top of it. "Okay, Dad," she said. "Here we go." The Reverie job was the hardest thing she had technically attempted. Some pieces were straightforward, a clean hem, a replaced zipper, a button restoration. But others required her to essentially reconstruct sections of garment that had deteriorated past simple repair. She developed, over those 10 weeks, techniques she'd never needed before, a method for reweaving moth-damaged wool that left almost no visible trace, a way of sourcing period-correct lining silks from estate sales and surplus suppliers that was time-intensive but achievable. She photographed everything. Posted the process in installments, not the finished work, but the work itself. The before. The diagnosis. The method. The reasoning. The posts went unusually wide for an account her size. By the time she delivered the Reverie lot, the Careful Stitch had 9,400 followers. More importantly, she had $3,200, minus materials, $2,100, and something she hadn't had since February, a concrete sense of what the business actually was. It wasn't alterations. It wasn't repairs. It was salvage. It was taking the things everyone else had written off and bringing them back. She rented the studio in November, exactly 1 year after moving into Diane's spare room. 400 square feet on the second floor of a building in Astoria, above a dry cleaner who became, incidentally, a useful source of referrals. The space was bare, painted cinder block, 2 industrial windows, a freight elevator that worked 3 days out of 5. The rent was $1,100 a month, which was aggressive for her budget but not impossible if she maintained volume. She moved the Juki in first. She bought a second machine, a vintage Bernina for detail work, from an estate sale for $180. She built her cutting table herself, from dimensional lumber, following her father's woodworking notes. It wasn't perfect. It was level and solid, and she built it with her own hands. She put her first business card on the table. The Careful Stitch. Restoration and Salvage. Sarah Calloway. She looked at her own name on the card for a long time. A fashion school graduate student named Priya had messaged her 3 times over the preceding months about the possibility of working or interning. Priya was 22, technically skilled, and, critically, willing to work part-time in exchange for mentorship and a modest hourly wage that Sarah could just barely afford. They met at a coffee shop near the studio. Sarah told her exactly what the business was, what she was trying to build, what she could offer and what she couldn't. She told Priya, "This is real work, not glamour work. You'll be reweaving moth damage for 4 hours at a stretch." Priya said, "I know. That's why I want to learn from you." They shook hands. 2 weeks later, Priya came to the studio every Tuesday and Thursday and occasional Saturdays. Sarah wrote in her journal on the first night she closed the studio alone, after Priya had left, "I have a space. I have a partner. I have a machine my father touched every day for 30 years. I have a waiting list. I have nothing figured out and I have everything I need." The second year was different from the first. The second year had structure. It had rhythm. It had the particular satisfaction of a business that knows what it is, not a side project, not a trial, but an actual operation with a defined identity and a growing reputation. Sarah woke up every morning and went to the studio. That sentence, simple as it is, represented something she hadn't had in more than a decade. A place that was hers, a purpose that bore her name, a professional identity that no court document could reassign. The clients who came to the Careful Stitch in the second year were different from the early ones. They were coming specifically. They had been referred, or they had followed the Instagram account for months, or they had read the piece that ran in a regional lifestyle magazine in March. A short feature that Sarah had initially declined, then agreed to, then sat with Lily and read together when it came out. "That's you, Mama," Lily had said, pointing at the photo. "That's me," Sarah had agreed. The work itself grew more complex, more demanding, more interesting. A museum contacted her about assessing a collection of 1920s beadwork. A film costume designer sent 3 period pieces that needed restoration for a production. A woman named Mrs. Kim brought in a hanbok, a traditional Korean ceremonial dress that had belonged to her great-grandmother and been damaged in a move. Sarah spent 3 weeks researching the specific textile traditions before she touched it. She hired a second part-time assistant in November. She upgraded her second machine. She applied for and received a small business microloan, $15,000, at a reasonable rate, through a local nonprofit lender, that she used to invest in equipment and a proper website. The careful stitch had 34,000 Instagram followers by the end of the second year. The revenue figure was $340,000. And a features editor at a morning lifestyle segment, nationally broadcast, the kind of show that runs between 8 and 10 on weekday mornings while America drinks its coffee, had seen the Instagram account and made a call. The television appearance was in April, 14 months into the second year. They sent a producer to the studio first, a methodical woman named Trisha who filmed B-roll and asked Sarah questions for about 2 hours. Sarah was nervous in the way she was nervous about most public things, privately, precisely, without visible signs. She answered every question the way she approached every garment, with specificity, with care, without exaggeration. When the segment aired, it ran for 11 minutes. It showed the studio. It showed Priya. It showed the before and after of Mrs. Kim's Hanbok. It showed the $340,000 revenue figure in text on screen, in the way those shows make everything feel like both an achievement and a moral. And at the end, the host asked Sarah, "What do you want people to take from your story?" Sarah looked at the camera for a moment. She said, "I think people underestimate what they still have when they've lost a lot. I spent a long time not thinking about the sewing machine in the garage because it reminded me of my father and I wasn't ready for that. And when I finally went out there, when I had nothing else left to try, I found out it still worked. I found out I still worked. And that turned out to be enough." The segment ended. In a hotel room in Chicago, Daniel Reeves was watching on his laptop, eating room service, preparing for a morning meeting. He watched the full 11 minutes. He watched Sarah speak about the machine, about the coats, about her father. He watched Priya discuss what she'd learned. He watched the number on the screen. He sat with it for a long time. Then he closed the laptop. And he sat in the dark. I won't tell you what he felt in that room, because I don't know, and because it doesn't ultimately belong to this story. His reckoning is his own. What I can tell you is that Sarah, at that exact moment, was sitting in the studio after everyone else had left, at the juki her father had used for 30 years, working on a 1940s peacoat that needed extensive moth damage repair, listening to a playlist Lily had made for her. She was not thinking about Daniel. She was thinking about the coat. About the year it was made. About the woman who had worn it. About what it had survived. She was thinking, I know how to fix this. I want to be careful about how I end this story, because easy endings do a disservice to complicated lives. Sarah didn't end up perfectly happy. She ended up actively building a life, which is a different thing, and in many ways a better one. It requires more of you, but it belongs to you in a way that passive happiness never quite does. Her relationship with Lily deepened after the divorce in ways that the custody arrangement, for all its inequity, couldn't prevent. Every other weekend became sacred, completely, fiercely sacred. She took Lily to the studio on Saturdays. She taught her to use the machine. She answered her questions about fabric and construction and why you press a seam before you sew the next one with the same seriousness her father had answered hers. Lily is 15 now. She wants to study architecture. She tells people her mother makes broken things whole, which is accurate in ways that go past the literal. Priya is Sarah's business partner, full partner, as of the third year. The Careful Stitch has 5 employees and a studio that has doubled in size. There is a wait list. There is, genuinely, a 6-month wait list, which means the people who found that index card at the laundromat in February 3 years ago are the founding myth of something that has become real. Sarah got a letter from Gerald Hoffman last spring. His granddaughter Miriam, the one the coat was altered for, wore it to her bat mitzvah. He enclosed a photograph. Sarah has it on the wall of her studio. As for the rest of it, the legal realities, the financial inequity, the documented disadvantage of economically dependent spouses in divorce proceedings, those haven't been resolved by Sarah's success. Her story is not evidence that the system works. It's evidence of what's possible when someone extraordinary refuses to let a system that failed them be the last word. Those are different things. The system still needs to change. And Sarah Calloway still shows up every morning to a studio with her name on the door and a machine that belonged to her father and a team of people who are building something worth building. Those things can both be true at once. There is a version of this story where the point is the money. The $340,000. The television segment. The before and after of a woman scorned who lands on her feet, perhaps with a quiet satisfaction at the thought of a man in a hotel room who watches the news and understands, too late, the weight of what he discarded. That version exists. It isn't entirely wrong. But what stays with me, what I keep coming back to, in all the time I've spent with this story, is the garage. February. The tarp. A woman who had lost most of what she thought defined her, standing next to a machine that still worked. Most of us have a machine in the garage. Something we set down when the conditions of our life required it, that we haven't looked at since. A skill. A voice. A version of ourselves that the years and the compromises and the practical necessities covered over. Sarah went out to the garage because she had nothing else left. Most of us don't wait for that. But maybe we don't have to.